Okay. Hello, and welcome to all of you tuning in to today's live virtual event hosted by the Global Chamber. My name is Henry Innes. I am the Global Chamber Executive Director of San Francisco. I'm also a general partner for DFJ Dragon Fund. We are a venture capital firm based here in Silicon Valley. And today I'll also be your moderator for this virtual event. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our host, Global Chamber. Global Chamber is a thriving and collaborating community of CEOs, executives, and professionals in 500 metros, growing businesses across borders. We provide leaders with more customers, more trusted partners, and more expert resources to grow globally. When members tap into Global Chamber, risk is reduced and global growth accelerates. Global Chamber is a very important organization with a really timely mission. As globalization continues to increase and we see economies intertwine, Global Chamber and organizations like Global Chamber will continue to increasingly play a critical role in the economic landscape. So good time to be part of the Global Chamber community. With that in mind, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's topic and also our speakers. Today's topic is China's economy, the new normal. Very important topic, and of course coincides well with the visit of President Xi coming here to the United States. When we talk about China's economy, it's a source of concern for a lot of the CEOs, executives, and leaders around the world, and I think a lot of that is predicated on the perceived lack of predictability. On the one hand, we've talked about a country that recently had a devaluation of its currency, which really caught a lot of people flat-footed. We saw the ripple effect in stock markets around the world. We've seen recent QE initiatives and economic indicators suggesting some potential weaknesses in the Chinese economy, concerns about the banking sector and potential write-offs. And of course, so many countries continue to rely heavily on trade with China. But of course, we're talking about a $10 trillion economy, a country with high savings, and relatively speaking, high GDP growth rate, and an economy that's transitioning right now from manufacturing services and this explosion of their middle class, right, which is going to be continue to be a consumption engine for China going forward. So how do we reconcile these sort of differing viewpoints and considerations, particularly in the context of today's discussion? To do that, we're going to rely on some really highly respected speakers. So let me introduce today, we have Rudy Vetter, who is the Chief Marketing Officer of the Green Card Fund. And we also have Christopher Clark, who is a professor at the Department of Management in Arizona State University. Welcome, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good.
Thank you so much for being here today. Why don't we take a moment to allow both of you to introduce yourselves, and then after that, we'll move forward to some of the questions. Rudy, you want to go ahead and start?
Yes, I can. Good morning, everyone, whoever is and wherever you are watching us this morning. My name is Rudy Vetter. You have to stand a German accent for a while. Yeah, a German accent in connection with China that might look a little exotic. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Green Card Fund. Green Card Fund is a USCIS recognized and and appointed regional center for EB5 investments into the United States. And for sure, one of the largest sources of EB5 investments into America comes out of China. EB5, for those who are not familiar with the term, that is the program of the United States where investors can invest $500,000 into a so-called regional center, who is allowed to pool this money like a fund is working and then invest it into projects in the United States. It's a job creation tool, so every $500,000 investment needs to correlate with the creation of 10 jobs in the American economy. The Green Card Fund here in Phoenix was the first regional center in the state of Arizona. In the meantime, we have created investments of about $80 million here in America. Next month, we will open our largest project that we have done so far, a hospital in the south of Tucson, Green Valley Hospital, where we have raised $56 million for, and to me a clear indicator how productive this program can be for our communities if it is well managed in all directions towards the project as well as towards the investors. About myself, I'm familiar with Chinese circumstances for pretty much a while, have been part of the raise of the Chinese economy when working for a German multinational in China in the early 2000s, at a time when this was still kind of a command economy, and later on as an economic developer for the Phoenix region, very much in touch with the raising solar industry and panel makers all over China over the last years. And I jokingly said this morning to Henry, somehow China always stays on my heels wherever I touch business. So far, I'm looking forward to this conversation then. Chris?
Interesting. Rudy, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Just on your background there or something. How important is Phoenix as a business center in the United States for Chinese interest or investment? It's not the New York, it's not the San Francisco, but I see we have the Chinese Cultural Center out by the airport, and I'm just interested in how important Phoenix is as a destination. You mentioned the solar industry.
Yeah, no, we still have to explain our Chinese counterparts all the time where exactly to find Phoenix, where exactly to find Arizona. Because you're completely right, the focus is East and West Coast. This is what they know, this is where they have been. And so it takes a while until they understand about the opportunities in the big part in between the two coastlines. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting because we do have quite a few Chinese students at Arizona State University.
Yeah.
And they know where the university is, and maybe as they go on in business, as future business leaders, they'll
very
remember.
true. And they're a source of business for us already. Yeah. So we will come later on to the probably. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me introduce myself. My name is Christopher Clark, and I am a professor at the Arizona State University in the Department of Management, teaching a course in international business, and primarily we talk about the U.S.-China relationship from the trade side, and the free trade agreements, and some of the topics that we've been talking about recently are, of course, President Xi Jinping's upcoming visit to the White House and some of the talk in the U.S. presidential elections, different candidates with different ideas of how to handle that official state visit, as well as the negotiation the United States is involved in now for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a massive free trade agreement which would exclude China as it links together these 12 Pacific Rim countries into a giant free trade agreement. We also have been talking about some of the patterns of Chinese investment in Africa, where China's been criticized in the past, as some have said that it was exploiting the mineral-rich countries and choosing countries which had poor governance or weak rule of law. And more recently, there's been a report that suggests that that's not accurate and that Chinese patterns of investment in Africa would reflect those of Western investments in terms of where they go. And so we deal primarily from the China-U.S. relationship from the standpoint of trade and free trade.
That's great. Thank you, gentlemen. Excellent background, I think, for today's conversation. So we have a few questions, and we'll start to go over them, and we'll just see where this conversation takes us. The first question, Chris, why don't we let you continue with this? Within the past few months, China's government has created quantitative easing. That being one of the world's largest economies has the possibility of having a huge effect on the rest of the world. Given your strong background on trade and all the focus that you have on China, what kind of impact do you see that these changes having, if any? And where do you see this having the most impact?
Well, in terms of the impact between the United States and China in the long term, the Chinese QE, which is sort of a hodgepodge of instruments that it's put together to help relieve local governments of tremendous debt. They may affect the opportunities of different businesses, different industries, segments in China, but we don't see this as anything that's going to affect or negatively affect the overall Chinese-United States investment relationship in the long term.
Okay, great. And how about you, Rudy? What's your thoughts on that based on some of the experiences that you're seeing out there right now?
You know, I would second that, we read a lot of big headlines in the recent weeks because the Chinese the measurements of the Chinese Federal Reserve went together with a partly collapse of the financial markets, and I personally saw a lot of those reports and headlines and would state them as being overrated and not fully understanding the Chinese realities, and very often also judging from a standpoint, from a perspective that is very much driven how we understand the economy should work. And the financial sector in China, inside of the Chinese economy, and Chris most probably knows that better than I do, plays a very different role than it does here in the Western world. Yeah, and so things are not that interwoven, and therefore the reaction mechanisms and the transmission mechanisms inside of the national economy in China are different than they are in the US or in Europe. And so that explains why I personally believe there is a disconnect between what happens in the financial market and in measures of the Fed against how the state of the real economy is. And it surely comes on top that we also have to understand that towards a market-driven economy, and the Federal Reserve has not the independence of making decisions like they do in the Western world. So there's a lot of politics in the game, a lot of government decision and party decisions. So again, I would sometimes love to see more expertise when those comments are written and sent out into the orbit, and creating the kind of trouble that we have seen in the recent weeks.
Yeah, you know, definitely in the past few weeks, there's certainly, at least in terms of headlines, you know, as you're pointing out, Rudy, that, you know, a lot of it was quite obviously negative, and a lot of people coming out, maybe possibly fear-mongering, because the general sentiment of great concern based on the feedback that's coming out of China. So much of this, it seems, has to do with perception. What do you gentlemen feel about, you know, in terms of what the stated growth rates are in GDP? You know, a lot of people cast doubt on what some of those numbers are. Do you both feel pretty? Sounds like you feel relatively good about the outlook for China. How do you guys feel in terms of the visibility of China and sort of the indicators that are coming out? You know, do you feel good about those numbers, or again, some people tend to discount them quite heavily?
Well, one of the concerns is the increase in private sector debt in China, a tremendous increase, quadrupling.
Yeah.
And you wonder how much the government knows in terms of the efforts it made to step in during the stock market slide a couple of weeks ago, the Shanghai Composite. For the government to take those kinds of actions and try to support that the markets, the data might be more, you know, revealing than what is publicly shared. We could only surmise about that, but there must have been some reason for it to feel it was serious enough to step in like that. They have so many of these retail investors who are invested into the stock market now. And people were just shocked to wake up one day and see that the money didn't continue to go up, that they'd had a slide in their markets.
Right.
Yeah, personally, Henry, I would still say that we are in a situation between a downgoing euphoria and a natural correction. So, and natural correction is something good in my feeling, and I think the chamber called it the new normal today. And that new normal most probably is something different to what we saw in the last 10 years. We may not see anymore the double-digit growth of the economy. We may see a more healthy growth, to be honest, that continues to be there. The economy in China most probably will continue to grow. It will grow in a different way than it has done in the last 10 years, in the last decade. It will be a shift of growth patterns away from kind of traditional large-scale industry sectors, very often driven by government-owned companies, towards more dynamic elements in the economy, like the service sector, like the IT-driven, technology-driven sectors in the industry. And I think this is all in a certain way encouraging. And nothing to be let's say, panicked about. I don't say that that China has no problems and everything is cozy and rosy, but I think we are on a way to a new normal, as said, and that can even help us to also position ourselves against that new market situation that China means to us and the opportunity that goes with it.
And you're referring to China's trying to move toward a more consumer-driven rather than export-driven economy overall, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we see that in a big way. So for sure, many of our own customers have been involved by the recent incidents in the market. We had in EB5 we deal with high net wealth individuals, and some of them came back to us and they have lost a double-digit amount of $1 million overnight. That can happen. To me, that's partly a result of something where I observe China simply cannot look back into a tradition of consumer or investment behavior. They never learned it. They never learned it the way we learned it in the Western world. We learned over 30 years how to invest into the stock market, and our stock markets have developed and evolved over years. Our consumption patterns have evolved over years, over decades. In China, I think the first mall in China opened 20 years ago or 10 years ago. They never had that. Yeah, and so it is in a certain way an internal challenge. That China sometimes tends to leapfrog. Yeah, or needs even to leapfrog because something more is available, yeah, and to them. So, and that for sure will cause its challenges and its opportunities. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a great segue, actually into our second question here, which, we're talking about China's new economy, right? And it's attempting to offset the weakening of the old economy, as you're both pointing out. They're attempting to rebalance away from exports down to the big mega infrastructure projects towards domestic consumption. So while we see all this happening in China, and even on my perspective, we're talking about an economy that's got internet and mobile penetration rates near 50%, right? So they're truly embracing the digital economy. They're moving to a service-oriented market. But what does this kind of impact mean for the world economy? And in what countries do you see this being affected the most? Either one of you want to jump in first, or Chris?
Maybe Chris is the expert on.
Yeah, well, I can attest to the connectedness of the Chinese population because riding in the subway in Shanghai over last December break, everybody's got the cell phone in their hand, and I was watching over their shoulders, and it's fast. So the country has definitely adopted the new technologies. Now, that, as an aside, they were also freezing the Gmail accounts, for foreigners like me at the time, right? So we'd get our internet, Gmail would work for about 4 hours on an afternoon, and then it would be gone for another 3 days. But in terms of opportunities, I'd say that the United States certainly has opportunities in China. There's certain restrictions on U.S. entry into business in China that raise thorny issues. One of the examples is DreamWorks Animation, the California movie production company, as well as Disney, have both moved into the Chinese market, but the Chinese rules require them to enter that market through a joint venture. So they had to decide whether they wanted to proceed with that and go into the Chinese market with a local partner like that and risk losing the technology, the proprietary technology that they have. So the opportunities are there. There's no question about it. It's more of a question of, can you pick the rose without, pricking the thorn? There are some problems in terms of the risk, like DreamWorks and Disney and Boeing and GE and all these companies that face the decision whether to go ahead and do business in China, where there are some of these forced localization policies that, in that instance, in the media market, required them to find a local Chinese partner and enter that market through a joint venture. So there's no question that the opportunity is there. It's China. It's different. It's the only market that every company feels it has to go to. But the question is, in terms of some of the restrictive ways that they have to do it and some of the risks that it carries, such as losing their proprietary technology, does the risk outweigh the benefit, or is the benefit greater than the risk? That's the question I think companies will face.
Yeah, I completely share your point, Chris, and would even point out some sectors that I see that most probably will offer the greatest opportunities for Western investors in China. And yes, but coming back maybe to the second question that Henry also asked, which countries are affected the most by those changes? So from the moment on that China is not just building infrastructure and industrial infrastructure anymore and becomes the workbench of the Western world, with all these positive and negative indications and impact. Take the environment and things like that all together. For sure, we've seen impact in Chris, you mentioned in your very first sentences, in Africa, for example, in parts of the world where the connection with China very much is defined by raw materials. And if China is asking maybe less of those kind of raw materials, we see a clear impact in those countries and in those continents. So therefore, I believe in some emerging countries, they most probably will feel that China will concentrate on different things, in South America and in Africa mainly. Regarding the domestic economy, I think everything depends on the famous race of the however defined middle class in China. And whatever happens to that group of people, and again, in China, size matters. If we talk about a small percentage of the population, it's still absolutely a huge number. So if in, I think, 2020 something, 50% of the urban population is middle class, and however you define that by income, that's a huge number. And if you take into account the migration that is still going on inside of China, which sometimes we underestimate the enormous effect done by the numbers. You hear and we read about those ghost cities that they have built where no one lives today. However, I still have in mind that there is a number of a double-digit million every year that still moves from rural into 10 to 15 million people every year, again and again. So there will be most probably a moment in time where these empty houses and empty complexes today will be filled with people, will be filled with life. And for sure, then there is that kind of sophistication of demand, of domestic demand. So there are sectors that have been underdeveloped, and they have not been, let's say, in the first row when the economy took off, and some sectors that are just a natural consequence of the continuing growth path, whether it's every aspect around it. yeah, building infrastructure. And there is a huge demand on infrastructure, and which goes closely together with the way how consumption will work and the consumption patterns that the Chinese will develop for themselves, which is not too far away from where we are already today. The Chinese version of Amazon is there, or and whether it's in B2B, Alibaba or so, they all need to look for correlating structures in their bags. And sectors that I can see as being the evolving and upcoming sectors for American and European companies to get invested in are, beside the logistical infrastructure, everything that has to do with e-trade and e-tailing. So I mentioned that they leapfrog. They are already in the IT-driven, digitally driven economy earlier and faster than anyone else, because they jumped more or less over the edge of ordinary conventional retailing. Education becomes vastly important for especially that growing middle class and the upper class, which correlates with a one child policy. And you have only that one child in an urban area, so you want to invest as much as you can into this child. Healthcare becomes a global business, and with all the phenomenons, again, we are back in the IT world here with medicine. So for someone who can afford it, he can get already diagnostics and services from Mayo Clinic in Phoenix. So again, huge potential. And then last but not least, it's all about traveling and tourism. Yeah, another large area China will evolve and will open and with the rest of the world. Yeah. So these are the major sectors that I can see, and I can also confirm that the people we work with, those people who really made a fortune in China, very often they come out of those sectors and they found their fortune there.
Those are great insights from the both of you. I think as both of you pointed out, China ultimately is a market that everybody needs to be in, but there's a lot of growing pains, right? And I think the government is trying to figure out what's the right calibration in terms of regulation to instill, but there's a lot of growing pains. And we look at the stock market, but it's a reminder that, if you look in the trailing 12 months, both the Shanghai and Shenzhen composite indexes are still up 30%. But there's a lot of retail investors that got hurt along the way. So these are the calibration points that I think the government is trying to figure out. But at the end of the day, as both of you pointed out, you're still talking about a middle class that's, in terms of population, greater than almost the entire United States, right? 300+ million people that are in the middle class. Huge consumption engine. And from our perspective, in the technology side, we're seeing great innovation that's coming out of China, especially, when you're talking e-commerce. They're talking somewhere upwards of 650 billion by 2020 in terms of e-commerce. In the fintech side, we're seeing a lot of great innovation, data analytics. It's just a lot of intellectual capital that's coming out of China, and you've got an administration that's very supportive of entrepreneurism in China right now. So there's a lot of people that are looking to Jack Ma and really want to be, the innovator and entrepreneur of the future. So there's a lot of optimism, I think, that's coming out of China. So a lot of good things potentially to keep an eye out for.
And Henry, one thing as you mentioned, as China reaches what it's eventually going to adopt for its regulatory and legal, framework, I think that's one of the challenges that U.S. businesses are facing, or maybe any foreign business, because the Chinese regulatory and legal environment, according to the executives that I had a discussion with about this, they identified as their number one challenge to doing business in China the fact that some of these regulations and laws shift so much. They told stories about going to the city offices or the local government offices and inquiring about the rules. Maybe it was environmental or maybe it was a labor standard, and being told that the law was being changed. Maybe there would be one answer if you were to ask in Beijing. There'd be another answer if you asked at the local government office, and they said that there could even be a different answer if you went back the next day or the following week. So things are just changing so rapidly, and not everybody in China at the local and capital levels are all on the same page, and this was actually what these executives had said was their #1 challenge to doing business day to day in China, not knowing exactly where the rules were.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, great. Thank you guys so much. And I want to, in the interest of time, move forward to another question that we have here. So, you know, I think they're saying Forbes writes here that thrift is another secret of China's success. With 25% personal savings rate, Chinese people rarely suffer from personal bankruptcies or foreclosures. The huge saving by Chinese people have created financial security for many Chinese families, reduced government spending on social welfare, and helping fund many grand infrastructure projects in China. However, you know, as pointed out earlier, the private sector debt is now twice the size of the GDP, or from some accounts more, right, 3 or 4 times. So, you know, a question posed to both of you is, what are some of the reasons for the discrepancy between the culture and the economy, and you know, in terms of the impact on the economy?
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago that we didn't discuss Chinese debt as any kind of threat to the world economy. It just wasn't an issue. But lately, that's changed with the type of debt that you see the local governments have assumed. And obviously, the government has been involved in just tremendous, massive infrastructure projects, which is where their debt, I'm sure, has been incurred. But one of the reasons that drives the Chinese phenomenal savings rate, or so they say, is the one birth policy, and that parents have saved money in order to assist their children, particularly their single sons, in finding a partner. So parents save so that they can help the son, and that's driven, according to some estimates, more than half of this very, very high private savings rate of the Chinese individual consumers.
Right.
Yeah, I believe this correlates with what we said before about the dynamics in simply the way how they deal with money that they did not have before, and there is no one who really told them what to do with their wealth, what to do with little wealth or large wealth, doesn't matter. But we are all socialized by our parents and grandparents and their attitudes towards money and towards saving or borrowing. You know, all this does not really exist in China. So there is, and we talk also here about a huge cultural discrepancy, you know, and for us it is important to understand, in my feeling, where these people come from, and how this all is evolving, how this whole process is going on. Where do they come from? Where do they go to? And who helps them to understand? And surely it's not the government that will do this, yeah. And so they have to make their own experiences. And a part of the clash of the stock exchange was simple because so many people just did not know what to do, what is right to do, and they panicked. They backed out of the market. They exited the market. And this kind of mass exit of the market made the whole situation even more dramatic and severe. And you see that in many different other ways. And partly the high saving rate is also an escape and an uncertainty about how to spend, where to put consumption in. And then there is uncertainty in the economy, especially in the private sector, because overall the things we discussed, there is that big apparatus of the party and of the federal government and the local government, and we sometimes, especially here in the West, underestimate how far this really goes into the daily life of the people and of entrepreneurs. And very often we, for example, really underestimate the local governments, the city governments. They are extremely powerful in China. And we always talk about the large Communist Party, but we sometimes ignore the rulers on a local, regional level that really on a day-to-day base control the activities in the local economy. And like almost with every politician, you know, there is uncertainty in the game. We don't know what they do with us. And that's true for the West as well as for the East, you know. So, and so that to a part, in my understanding, maybe in larger cultural dimension explains what we observe there.
And it is in the interest of both nations to have the other one strong. The United States would not be a victory for the United States if China's economy collapsed. We both depend on one another.
Correct. Yeah.
That's one of the interesting things about the upcoming presidential visit by Xi Jinping to Washington, D.C., is that the relationship between these two countries has been ostensibly cooperative for years, but it looks like at this point the countries have to make a decision in how they treat each other diplomatically, and whether they want to continue to be cooperative or whether we're going to move to an age in which China and U.S. become superpowers engaged in overt rivalry instead of trying to cooperate in the way that we've tried in the past.
Yeah, yeah. Chris, you make a very good point here, because something that also when it's about the IP discussion, for example, people a little bit underestimate in how far the Chinese economy is already interwoven with the global economy, and in how far the dynamics play in this direction that it even gets larger, that kind of interrelationship. If you would simply take the fact what Chinese investments do in the United States, yeah, and so I think China today is most probably the largest investor in American companies in terms of M&A activity. And there is a complete reversal trend. I remember that in 2008, 2009, a lot of acquisitions were done in China by American companies, right. And now we have these a turnaround effect. Yeah, and Chinese companies acquire American companies in a significant multi-billion-dollar amount. Yeah.
Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States has gone up from maybe 120 million to at this point in the billions. They're investing. That was part of the emphasis of this article on Chinese patterns of investment in Africa, and the point was that it's not just investing in resource-rich countries. China has been directing a lot of its FDI toward the economies of the world, including the United States, as you say.
Yeah, it's certainly you know, an interesting time where I think everyone can agree that the economies are so intertwined and so critical for cooperation. But at the same time, and in a lot of the agenda for this visit for President Xi, you know, is sort of shoring up that trust, right? That, you know, when you've got acquisitions coming into the U.S. or U.S. doing business in China, that there's sort of this mutual trust that we can, you know, IP will be secure, and also, you know, what are the interests that are being agendas in terms of acquisitions from a strategic standpoint. But economically, you know, to your point, Chris and Rudy both, it's just that, you know, making sure that the economies both continue to resonate well and cooperate well together is critical going forward.
Correct, yeah. And to Chris's point that America could not have any interest in a weak China, I think you said it right. Foreign direct investment is the buzzword for it. If America invests, I think they are the largest foreign direct investor still in China with more than $60 billion a year, and you want to get a return on that, yeah. And you only get a return from your investments in China, which is still very much manufacturing investment and less acquisitions. You only get that return when there is a strong economy that you have invested into, yeah.
Gentlemen, I hate to say it, but I'm going to have to jump off because I've got some highway travel to do to get where I have to go this morning. So I'm sorry to leave you.
Your students are waiting.
Chris, thank you so much for your insights today. We greatly appreciated your participation. And, you know, actually, we've pretty much covered all of our topics here. And frankly, I think we've really done a good job, both of you gentlemen, of covering a lot of ground, both from a cultural standpoint and also certainly from the economic side, and the U.S. and China both cross-border interests. So, you know, I think we've pretty much covered our agenda today here, so I think we might be at a good stopping point. But again, I want to thank you both so much for your participation, and of course thank the Global Chamber for hosting today's event, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you again in the future.
Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Rudy. It's a pleasure.
Thank and Chris, to the Chamber. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you both.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.